So here we are again, and the topic this time is the 5 elements that we refer to in Hung Gar. But before I do that, I just like to bring our attention to the disclaimer that we've mentioned before. And that is that the ideas, principles that we're talking about here are based on my understanding from the training and learning and teaching of Hung Gar, as well as discussions with other people. And in no way do we claim that this information is necessarily comprehensive or totally precise or even agreed to by everybody. And the comments and suggestions are always welcome should somebody have any other ideas. So let's start now talking about the 5 elements. First of all, I want to talk about how things began. So we're now looking at the concept in the Chinese culture of the universe. And in the beginning, there was what is called yin and yang. And it's believed that heaven was created by an accumulation of yang, and earth was created by an accumulation of yin. The next thing that happened is that water and fire, which we're familiar with on the earth, became the symbols of yin and yang. And then beyond that, nature expanded into a number of forces, which we now see as fire, earth, metal, water, and wood. And they became, or they're represented as, processes of change through life and on earth. Everything is constantly changing. And so these things that we refer to as the 5 elements actually are more correctly referred to as the 5 phases. And in Chinese, in Cantonese, this is called Hung. And the word Hung represents movement. You know, it can be translated as walking or moving. So the whole representation here is that it's a moving thing. It's not static. And the next thing I want to talk about is, or introduce you to, is the unique characteristics that relate to each of these phases. So each of the phases, and we'll start with the wood phase, the green one, there are a number of things. So first of all, we can talk about development or the seasons. And the season belonging to the wood phase is spring. That's when everything begins. We see life beginning in nature. We see new plants growing in springtime. Right. And in our human development, that represents birth. And associated with the wood element or the wood phase is a climatic condition, and that represents wind. We also can associate a certain emotion to it, which is anger. And then we can have a sound associated with it, which is shouting.
I thought the anger should be in the fire, but actually it's not. It's for wood.
Yes, yeah. Fire is all about. So fire is all about.
I'm looking forward to see what fire is, and in my mind, like we learn from a child, we have only 4 seasons, but now we have like 5 phases here. So I'm looking forward again to see how it represents.
Okay, we'll get to that.
Okay.
So, and then the sound associated with the wood phase is shouting, and the 5 senses that relate to that is the sense of sight. So now we get the concept that the wood phase has some relationship to do with the eyes and the sense of sight, and the flavor associated with it is the sour flavor. So if we move on, we see that the fire phase, the season is summer. And the personal development of the humans is growth. So now we're growing, we're becoming active, and the climate associated with that is the hot climate, which makes sense because it's fire. And you mentioned if you're angry, it's all about fire. Well, it's just the opposite.
Yeah. Oh, okay, makes sense.
The emotion associated with the fire phase is actually joy, and therefore the sound is laughter, and the sense is speech. So you're looking at the tongue and the mouth and anything to do with speech. And the flavor is bitter, associated with the fire element or phase. And the next one, this is the earth phase, and this is the additional season that you asked a question about.
Yeah.
There's a season called late summer, and that's what happens in this earth phase. So summer actually consists of two things. First of all, the summer that we know it, and then it depends where you live in the world, but certainly in Hong Kong, we begin to experience the latter weeks of summer can be extremely hot. There is an overly hot phase that takes place towards the end of summer, and that's called the late summer. And then the development that's associated with that, the human development, is one of transformation. So if we start again looking at the wood, we are born, and then we go through a growth phase, and then we transform ourselves. We mature, we learn all sorts of things, we change, and that's what happens during that earth phase. And then the climate associated with that is humid, which we also experience during late summer in some parts of the world. And the emotion associated with that is sympathy. And the sound is singing, the five senses is the sense of taste and touch, and the flavor that belongs to earth is sweet. So if we progress to the metal phase, the season is autumn, and that's a time in human development, and also if it also relates to farming, of harvesting. Now we're getting towards middle age, and so we rely on everything that we've learned, and we begin to harvest our knowledge and use things in a different way. And the climate associated with the metal phase is dryness, and the particular emotion is grief and worry. And so that gives us the sound of crying, and the sense associated with it is smell, and the flavor is the hot or pungent, the spicy flavor.
Okay.
Then we move on to the final phase, which is the season of winter, and that's a time of storage. In human terms, that's not the time to be sort of overly active and developing and growing, although it doesn't mean that we can't do that, but it's not the time to begin doing that. We can continue that to some extent, but nature is such that sooner or later we will lose the ability to do things. And the climate associated with that is the cold climate, being winter, and the emotion is fear, and the sound is one of groaning, and the sense is the sense of hearing, and the flavor is salty. So that introduces a number of unique characteristics that relate to each of these phases. I'm not saying there's only 7. There's hundreds of things, hundreds of things. I'm just giving you an introduction to some of them.
Yeah, and I can see the elements here. It's not just talking about the correlation between these, you call the phases, with the weather is also highly related to like the pathway of the human life, our life, and also it seems like the emotional sensation and highly related to some like the part of the human body as well, isn't it?
Exactly. And in terms of Chinese medicine, for example, we may know people who are always worried, they're not happy. It seems as though they have grief in their life. They're not very outgoing. And so in terms of Chinese medicine, if we come across someone like that, the first thing we think of is the metal element or the metal phase. So we begin to associate people, situations in terms of these 5 phases. And that helps us in being able to diagnose problems. And as you'll see in a moment, the metal element is responsible for the organs of the lung and the colon, the colon being the large intestine. So you may see people who are not very happy, who are down, they feel a lot of grief and they're always worried. It's not unusual for those people to have issues with their large intestine and their lungs. So this is where this system of the 5 phases becomes extremely useful as something to apply in life. Okay.
Yes, because in Chinese medicine, they always talk about the balancing between these 5 elements. So therefore, if you find some kind of symptoms, then it means that there may be the possibility of these elements is either too strong or too weak.
That's correct.
That means lose a balance. Yes.
That's correct. And in Chinese medicine and in life, we all need to find a balance of these 5 things, and they need to exist in harmony. For example, I do know of some people who, in their food, 90% of what they eat is spicy.
Yes, right.
And so my observation of that is that if that's what you're going to do and you're only going to eat those types of food, then perhaps you're heading for problems because you achieve that balance. We all should try to have that balance in life. So we should have the sweet, the spicy, the salty, the sour, and the bitter flavors. They're all important to us because they support our organ systems and they will support our life and create balance in what we do. Okay. And perhaps the most difficult one for most people is the bitter. I'm not suggesting everybody drink beer, but it's very difficult for people to understand what the bitter flavor is. So that's just an introduction to how these 5 phases are used in representing life and can affect life if we don't work at trying to get balance and harmony between them all. And even in Hung Gar, I'm just going to digress for a moment. But if we look at the sounds, particularly in some of the later forms, like Titsington, where we've got different sounds, we can inject these sounds into what we're doing, and we can be mindful of these things. So we can inject the shouting and very much so. We know what that is in Hung Gar. We can inject the laughter in certain movements that we do. We can have a singing feeling behind what we're doing. We can have a crying feeling, which is one of grief and despair, being sad in what we do, in the sound we make. And we can have a groaning sound that we make. And personally, I make all of those sounds with certain things that I play, because I am mindful of wanting to have in my life all of those sounds, because they're necessary for me to stay in harmony. So let's move on rather than get off the topic.